I never thought much about silence. Some people fear it, find it eerie, unsettling. But for me, silence had always been a comfort. It was the quiet moments after a long day when I could finally breathe, the stillness before falling asleep next to the woman I had loved for over a decade. Silence had never betrayed me. Until that night. It was late. Later than usual. I had been sitting in my car for almost an hour, parked outside my own home, staring at the house I had worked so hard to build. I wasn't avoiding going inside, I told myself that, but something in my gut made me hesitate. Lynette and I hadn't been arguing, not exactly. Lately, though, things had felt different. Colder. Like we were living parallel lives in the same space. I chalked it up to stress, to routine, to the natural ebb and flow of marriage. But something about tonight, something I couldn't name, made me pause before walking through that door. I stepped inside as quietly as I could, kicking off my shoes at the entrance. The house was dim, only the soft glow from the kitchen light spilling into the hallway. Then I heard it, a whisper, low but unmistakable. I froze. Lynette was on the phone. I knew I shouldn't listen. I wasn't the kind of man who made a habit of spying on his wife. But the way she spoke, hushed, almost conspiratorial, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then, clear as day, I heard her say the words that shattered everything I thought I knew. I hate being with him. The air left my lungs. It's exhausting. Every single day, I feel trapped. If I had the courage, I'd leave and never look back. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding so loudly I thought she might hear it through the walls. She was talking about me. Not an argument in the heat of the moment, not an exaggeration born from frustration. This was raw, unfiltered truth. I had spent years thinking we were building a life together. That we were just going through a rough patch. That deep down, she still loved me. But now, standing in the dim hallway of my own home, I realized something terrifying. I was the only one still trying. And maybe I had been for a long time. I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. It didn't feel real. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe she was talking about someone else, venting about a coworker, a friend, some distant cousin I had never met. But deep down, I knew better. Her voice, the weight of her words, the exhaustion in her tone, it was all too raw, too deliberate. She hated being with me. A cold chill ran down my spine. I wanted to walk into the kitchen, to confront her, to demand an explanation. But I didn't move. I just stood there, my fingers gripping the edge of the doorway as her conversation continued. I know, she sighed, exasperated. I should have ended things a long time ago. But it's complicated. The house, the finances. It's not that simple. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just frustration. It wasn't just a passing comment. She had thought about leaving me. She had planned it, or at least she wanted to. And the only thing keeping her here was convenience. Not love. Not commitment. Just logistics. I felt like I was suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. My hands curled into fists, nails biting into my palms as I forced myself to breathe. She kept talking, unaware that her every word was driving a knife deeper into my chest. I just need a little more time, she continued, her voice softer now. I don't want to hurt him. I want to be sure. Be sure? Be sure about what? Whether she could do better. Whether I was worth throwing away completely. My heart pounded so hard it echoed in my ears. I had spent years building a life with Lynette. I had poured everything I had into our marriage, into making her happy. And all this time she had been weighing her options, deciding whether I was worth the inconvenience of leaving. I turned and walked back toward the front door, my movements mechanical, my body detached from my thoughts. I needed to get out of there. To breathe. To think. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, the night air hitting me like a slap to the face. It was quiet, the kind of oppressive silence that felt deafening. My legs carried me to my car before I even realized what I was doing. I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could have stormed back in there. I could have confronted her, demanded answers, forced her to look me in the eye and tell me the truth. But something in me didn't want to hear it from her lips. I wasn't ready for that. So instead, I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I started the car. And I drove away. I didn't have a destination. I just drove, the hum of the engine and the blur of streetlights outside my window the only things grounding me in reality. My mind raced, looping her words over and over like a song stuck on repeat. I hate being with him. If I had the courage, I'd leave and never look back. I just need a little more time. How long had she felt this way? Was it new? Or had she been living a lie for months? Years? Had I been fooling myself all this time, thinking we were just in a rough patch? I gritted my teeth, gripping the wheel so tightly that my arms ached. The thought of her pretending, of smiling at me during dinner, kissing me goodnight, waking up next to me while secretly resenting every moment, it made me feel sick. I pulled into an empty parking lot behind a closed diner, the neon, open 24 hours sign flickering uselessly in the window. I turned off the engine and leaned back against the headrest, exhaling slowly. My hands were still shaking. I had no idea how long I had been driving, how far I had gone. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the gnawing truth I couldn't escape. Lynette didn't love me. Or maybe she did once, but that version of us was long gone. I ran a hand through my hair, my fingers shaking as I tried to gather my thoughts. What was I supposed to do? Go back home, pretend I hadn't heard anything, and just wait for the day she finally built up the courage to leave? Pack a bag and disappear, let her wake up to an empty house and figure it out on her own? Neither option felt right. Neither option felt like me. I had always been the kind of guy who fought for what he loved. I wasn't perfect, but I didn't give up. But how do you fight for someone who's already decided they don't want you? The realization settled in my chest like a stone. I had already lost. I just hadn't known it until tonight. The idea of confronting her right away felt impossible. If I walked back through that door now, I wasn't sure what I'd say, what I'd do. I wasn't even sure I could look at her without hearing those words echoing in my head. A sudden knock on my window jolted me out of my thoughts. I turned my head sharply, my heart hammering. An older man, maybe in his 60s, stood outside my car, his face lined with exhaustion. His uniform, a faded button-up and a grease-stained apron, told me he worked at the diner. He motioned for me to roll the window down. I hesitated before finally lowering it an inch. "You good, son?" His voice was rough, worn from years of cigarettes or maybe just life itself. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Because no, I wasn't good. I wasn't even close to good. But I couldn't bring myself to admit that to a stranger. So instead, I forced a nod. "Yeah. Just needed a minute." The man studied me for a long moment before shrugging. "All right. Just looked like you were sitting here drowning in something heavy. Figured I'd check." He turned to walk away, but before I could stop myself, I called out, "Hey, you ever been married?" He paused, glancing back at me with something unreadable in his eyes. 32 years, he said finally. "Lost her 2 summers ago." I swallowed hard. Did you ever feel like she was just waiting for an excuse to leave?" The man let out a slow breath, stepping closer to lean against the side of my car. "No," he said simply. "But I knew men who did." I gripped the wheel, waiting. "They all asked themselves the same thing," he continued. "What did I miss? Was it me? Did I change, or did she? And you know what? None of them ever got a real answer." I exhaled shakily. "So what do you do when you realize the person you built your life with doesn't want to be there anymore?" He sighed, glancing up at the diner's flickering sign. "You make a choice. You either stay and live with the knowing, or you go before they make the choice for you." I sat there in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Maybe, deep down, I had already made my decision. Maybe I just wasn't ready to face it yet. I sat in that parking lot longer than I should have. Long enough for the old man to disappear back inside the diner. Long enough for the flickering neon light to start feeling like a heartbeat pulsing against the dark. Long enough to wonder how the hell I had gotten here, parked in the middle of nowhere, afraid to go back to my own home. I had always thought I'd see it coming. If Lynette ever stopped loving me, I figured I'd notice the little things, the way she looked at me, the way she touched me, the way she spoke. But now that I replayed everything, I realized the signs had been there all along. They just hadn't looked the way I expected. It wasn't like she had suddenly pulled away. If anything, it was the opposite. She was still present. She still kissed me on the cheek when I left for work. Still texted me reminders about dinner or asked if I needed anything from the store. She still slept beside me every night, still laughed at my jokes, still talked about plans for the future as if she actually meant them. And that was what hurt the most. She had been acting. Playing a role. Pretending, for my sake or maybe for hers. And I had bought into it because I wanted to. Because I needed to believe that whatever rough patch we were going through was just that, a phase. A temporary lapse in connection, something we'd worked through like we always had. But now I knew the truth. She wasn't waiting for us to fix things. She was waiting for the right moment to leave. I gritted my teeth, my jaw tightening as I reached for my phone. My fingers hovered over her contact name. For a split second, I considered calling her, saying I wasn't coming home tonight, forcing her to admit what she had been hiding. But then what? What would that accomplish? A confession wasn't going to change the reality of what I had heard. I didn't need her to say the words to my face. I already knew how she felt. A new thought took root in my mind, one that I hadn't considered until now. If Lynette had been thinking about leaving, then maybe she had already done more than just think about it. My chest tightened at the possibility. What if she had already checked out? What if she was just biding her time while she lined up something else, someone else? The thought made my stomach turn. I had never been the jealous type, never been insecure in my marriage. But now I had to wonder, was there someone she had been confiding in about me? Someone who was encouraging her, reassuring her that she deserved better? The idea of her with another man wasn't just painful. It was humiliating. I shook my head and forced myself to breathe. Sitting here, letting my mind spiral, wasn't going to change anything. I needed to know. Without giving myself a chance to back out, I turned on my car and pulled out of the lot. But I didn't drive home. I drove somewhere else. Lynette had never been careless. If she was hiding something, she wouldn't leave obvious clues. But there were always cracks, tiny details that people overlooked when they thought they were in control of a lie. And I was going to find them. The first place I checked was our shared phone account. It was something we had set up years ago, back when trust had never been a question. I pulled up the records, scrolling through the call logs, looking for anything unusual. And then I saw it. A number I didn't recognize. Repeatedly. At odd hours. Short calls. Long ones. A pattern. I stared at the screen, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My hands felt numb as I copied the number and pasted it into a search bar. No name came up. Just a generic mobile carrier. But I didn't need a name. Because I already knew what this was. This was the proof. The proof that whatever I had with Lynette, whatever I had been holding onto, was already gone. I gripped my phone tightly, staring at the screen as if the answers I needed would suddenly appear. My thoughts were tangled, a chaotic mess of doubt, suspicion, and reluctant acceptance. Every rational part of me wanted to believe I was overreacting, that I was reading too much into something that wasn't there. But my gut? My gut was screaming at me that something was very, very wrong. I had always trusted Lynette. Even when things had started feeling different, when our conversations had become more shallow, when the warmth in her eyes had slowly faded into something distant, I had held on to the belief that we were just going through a rough patch. Every couple does, right? That's what I told myself. That's what I needed to believe. But now, staring at my phone, at the repeated calls to a number I didn't recognize, the weight of reality settled in my chest like a stone. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't some irrational fear creeping into my mind because of a bad day. This was real. There was a pattern. A deliberate secrecy. And deep down, I already knew what it meant. Still, I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if I confronted her and she had a perfectly reasonable explanation? What if this number belonged to a friend she hadn't told me about or a work contact? But no matter how I tried to twist the facts to make them fit a comfortable narrative, they didn't add up. Lynette wasn't the type to hide things. And yet here I was, uncovering something she clearly hadn't wanted me to see. A deep breath filled my lungs, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside me. My fingers hovered over the screen, temptation whispering in my ear. I could call the number right now. Hear the voice on the other end. Maybe that would tell me everything I needed to know. But a voice in the back of my head stopped me. No, that wasn't the way to handle this. If I was going to uncover the truth, I needed to be smart. I needed to be patient. My next move couldn't be driven by emotion. I leaned back in my seat, gripping the wheel with both hands as I forced myself to think. If I was right, if Lynette really was hiding something, then tonight would be the night to confirm it. So instead of going home, I made a decision. I was going to wait and see what she did when she thought I wasn't looking. I parked my car a few streets away from our house, the dim glow of the streetlights barely illuminating the quiet neighborhood. The world outside felt eerily still, as if holding its breath for what was about to unfold. My heart pounded against my ribs, a mixture of dread and reluctant determination weighing heavily in my chest. I wasn't the kind of man who played detective. I had never doubted Lynette before, never even thought to question where she went or who she talked to. But now, for the first time in our marriage, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being deceived. I kept my distance, watching from the shadows as the porch light flickered on. The front door creaked open, and Lynette stepped outside, moving with an ease that made my stomach twist. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't hesitating. She didn't check her surroundings or look over her shoulder like someone sneaking off to do something wrong. She had done this before. That thought nearly knocked the air out of me. She was dressed differently than she had been earlier, no longer in the cozy loungewear she usually wore at home. Now her jeans were perfectly fitted, her blouse casual but stylish. Subtle but intentional. She looked good. She looked like someone who was trying to impress. I forced myself to breathe as I watched her lock the door behind her, get into her car, and drive off into the night. A moment of hesitation gripped me. I could turn around right now. Go home. Pretend I never saw any of this. But then what? Live in blissful ignorance? Continue waking up next to a woman who might not even want to be there anymore? No. I had to know. I started my car, keeping a safe distance behind hers as she made her way through the city streets. She didn't take any unexpected turns, didn't glance in her rearview mirror, didn't hesitate at any intersections. She wasn't being careful because she didn't think she had to be. 15 minutes later, I saw the sign. A hotel. My stomach dropped. I pulled into a parking spot across the street, my hands clenched around the wheel as I watched her park. She stepped out, adjusting her purse strap as she walked with quiet confidence toward the entrance. My chest tightened with every step she took. She didn't pause. She didn't hesitate. She knew exactly where she was going. And then, the final blow. Through the large glass doors, I watched as she approached the front desk. The receptionist greeted her with familiarity. Lynette smiled, her body language relaxed as she slid a card across the counter. The receptionist nodded, typed something into the computer, and handed her a keycard. No conversation. No confusion. This wasn't a first-time visit. She turned and made her way toward the elevators, disappearing behind the doors as they slid shut. I sat there frozen. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was reality. And there was no coming back from it. I had never felt so alone in my life. Sitting there in the darkness, watching the woman I had loved for years vanish into a place she clearly felt comfortable in, a place that wasn't ours, was like having the ground ripped out from under me. I felt weightless, unanchored, like nothing in my world was real anymore. I should have been angry. But I wasn't. I just felt done. I wasn't going to storm in there. I wasn't going to make a scene. That's what she expected, wasn't it? A dramatic confrontation, an explosion of emotions, something she could use to twist the narrative. But she wouldn't get that from me. Instead, I turned my car back onto the road, heading home with a calmness that surprised even me. I walked through the front door and stood in the quiet house, letting the reality settle. This wasn't my home anymore. It was just a place I had been living, a place where I had built a future that no longer existed. I didn't pack in a rush. I didn't throw things into a suitcase like I was running from a disaster. No, I packed carefully, methodically. Just the essentials. I wasn't leaving with anger, I was leaving with clarity. Once my bag was packed, I sat at the kitchen counter and picked up a pen. Lynette. I know. I heard you. I saw you. And I understand. I won't fight for someone who doesn't want to be here. So I'm making this easy for you. I'm leaving. Don't worry about explanations. I don't need them. I just hope that whatever you were looking for was worth it. I placed the note on the counter, set my house key beside it, and took one last look around. Then, without a second thought, I walked out. I didn't know exactly where I was going yet. Maybe I'd crash at Oliver's for a while. Maybe I'd drive until I found a place that felt right. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't holding on to something broken. I was finally free. And that was worth more than anything I had lost. The night air hit my face as I stepped outside, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a weight I hadn't realized I had been carrying for years. The street was quiet, the world moving on as if nothing had happened, as if my life hadn't just shifted in a way I couldn't have imagined even a day ago. But as I stood there, inhaling deeply for the first time in what felt like forever, I realized something. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. I threw my bag into the passenger seat of my car, slid behind the wheel, and started the engine. The low hum filled the silence, grounding me, reminding me that I was in control now. No more waiting. No more hoping for something that had already died. No more pretending that love still lived where only obligation remained. As I pulled away from the house, no, I corrected myself, her house now. I expected to feel sorrow, regret, doubt. But instead I felt relief. The weight that had been sitting on my chest for months, maybe even years, had lifted. The fear of the unknown had been replaced by something else entirely. Freedom. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, pulling my attention for a moment. I glanced over. Lynette. I let it ring. What could she possibly say now? That she was sorry? That it wasn't what it looked like? That she had made a mistake? No. I wasn't going to let her rewrite the truth. Whatever words she wanted to spill now, they weren't for me. Not anymore. I kept driving, the road stretching ahead like a promise. Maybe I'd go to Oliver's for the night. Maybe I'd keep driving until I found a place that felt like mine. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't tied down to someone else's indecision. For the first time in a long time, my life was mine again. and I wasn't looking back.